So, hello everyone. My name is Veet, or at least that's what I go by in most alterhuman spaces, and this is my panel on archetropy, or identifying as an archetype or stock character. If any of you have seen this panel before at OtherCon, it is the exact same panel. There's like one minor change that I'll note when it comes up, but it's basically the same. No drastic changes if you've already seen that one. Although I'm hoping some new folks see this and might learn from it. Uh, so, our agenda for this presentation, I'm going to, introduce what the term means, how it relates to other alterhuman labels, define what an archetype is if we're talking about what it means to identify as one, and talk about related terms, developing symbols, before concluding what I think this means or what could happen to the community. So about me, as I said, I go by Veet. I tend to prefer no pronouns, but they, them, or any neos are fine. I'm a border collie therian, relevant to Centaurus. I am a fallen otherkin, generally a furry. Because I'll use it as an example later, I will mention that I work as a mental health professional. Please do not ask me to be your therapist, because that would be wildly unethical. Uh, And relevant to this presentation, I identify archetypally as a paladin and right-hand man, gender-neutral man. So first, let's get into the term, its history, and why the heck we need it at all. So what is archetropy? It's an alterhuman label for identifying with or as an archetype, trope, stock character, etc., in ways that might be similar to a kin type. When this term was developed, it was deliberately made to be linguistically flexible. So I can use it as a noun. I am an archetrope. My type, my archetrope is paladin. I have a right-hand man archetrope. We played with the idea of using arche as a prefix for a type, so archepaladin, archewizard, archejester. I experience archetropy in the noun form, or archetropal as an adjective. But you can sort of see I'm trying to leave it fairly generic and usable. In terms of history, as the word itself, archetrope was coined in 2021 on the Non-Human National Park forums by the Corvidae Collective. However, this was definitely not the first time that anybody talked about identifying as an archetype. We are not reinventing the wheel. So before this, and from records I could find, the oldest I can find were in the early 2000s, although they almost certainly happened earlier. Some people identified with what we would consider classical therian or otherkin identities, such as dragons, foxes, coyotes, etc., but for archetypal reasons. So, for example, someone might identify with the mythical archetype of the fox as a trickster or as a folkloric character. Around the 20-teens, there was a tendency toward concept kin, such as like titlekin, royalkin, so you would see people posting about things like princekin, knightkin, etc. At the time, this was often debated in the community or outright rejected. So I was able to find a post from 2016 where some anonymous person, literally it's an anonymous Tumblr question, I don't know who this was, said, I agree that object, time, and titlekin aren't possible, but I believe conceptkin is. So, right, even for someone who believed in general concepts, that could be somebody's identity. They were like, well, obviously, those people that identify with particular titles can't be real. So this would be my guess as to why the word trope type, which has basically an identical meaning, and was coined in the Alt-H forums in 2017, didn't seem to get off the ground much. It may have just been facing an absolute steamroll of respectability politics and people not really acknowledging title or role-based identities at the time. A survey published by the Silver Elves in 2019 mentions ranger and witch kind, although these people probably, again, were older and existed before. It's just that the survey was published in 2019. And in 2020, I was able to find forum threads about people identifying as rangers or primal. So again, this is that idea of like identifying as a particular role or way of being that is not a species. Uh, I will take a moment here to distinguish between archetypal causes for an identity versus identifying as an archetype. So altered humanity, for example, a classic stereotype or kintype, could have multiple possible reasons. So somebody could identify as a dragon and they think that it's because of neurodivergence, or they can identify as an alien through past life beliefs, or they can identify as a cat for archetypal reasons. Right? They identify as the archetype of the cat as sneaky or independent, or right the way it is presented in folklore or stories. Meanwhile, what is the identity itself? Is the identity itself an archetype? So, regardless of cause. So, someone could identify as a mad scientist for psychological reasons, or a magical girl due to spiritual parallel lives, or as a hermit by voluntary choice. Obviously, there is an overlap between these things. Archetypes are socially constructed by cultures. Cultures tell stories about animals and other phenomena. So who can identify as the cat archetype for archetypal reasons. They can call themselves a cat therian. They can call themselves a cat archetrope. Both are true. These are not mutually exclusive terms. So, why bother with a word? We have words like conceptkin, we have other terms. Why do I need to use the word archetrope? Well, a lot of the early archetype discussions were still rooted in non-humanity. So, example, those like ranger or wild or feral archetypes. And a lot of archetypes are human or species neutral. As a paladin, that's usually a human term, although obviously there are characters and fictions where like mice can be knights and aliens can be knights, and right the idea of a knight or a paladin isn't rooted in any particular species. Archetypal identities can, to the person having them, feel different from both species and individual, as in like fiction can or past life identities, right? There is identifying as a particular individual fictional character, and there is identifying as the broad trope of the evil mastermind. And existing language can apply, but doesn't always. For example, personally, I think concept can works as a broader umbrella, but also covers things that are concepts but not archetypes, such as colors or music or neon. Um, Personally, the reason I think it's useful to have a term is that it gives uh, people words to use in discussions and to explore their experiences. So, what does it mean to identify as an archetype? Well, I argue that it is a form of embodying. So, archetypes are fundamentally larger than life. I use this illustration to point out that, like, a real life horse is different from a 2D artistic shadow projected idea of a horse, right? Archetypes are inherently simplified and iconic, right? Like, Clark Kent, the fictional character, is an individual person. The superhero archetype is bigger and broader and more general than that. This can make archetypes unrealistic to day-to-day life, but it also makes them powerful, impactful, and meaningful to people. Archetypes are by nature narrative tools. They are socially constructed and culture specific. So there might be archetypes in your particular culture that are very common in folklore or stories that don't really translate elsewhere. No possible catalog of archetypes would be comprehensive or universal. Some places list common archetypes, but that doesn't mean that these are the only definitions or that you have to pick from that list. Psychologist Carl Jung had an idea of people having this collective unconsciousness or shared archetypes like the mother or the martyr. The TV tropes collects common story tropes and tries to define them. Tarot cards often have specific archetypal ideas of the fool or the emperor. On a sociological or anthropological perspective, there's the Arne Thompson-Uther classification of folktales, which again just tries to historically categorize different repeated motifs in stories, such as the Cinderella idea or the evil stepsister. Overlaps and interrelationships between archetypes are common because these, again, are just narrative tools. Which term fits is entirely personal. I call myself a paladin, but the same traits could easily overlap with the idea of a knight, a hero, a cleric. There's a lot of words that can fit. My personal best way of thinking about it is that archetypes are a social role. And you might be asking, what do you mean social role? How can it be a social role? So, for example, take the word sister. That seems like a really simple word with a really simple definition. But it has a biological meaning in that it can mean someone who shares 50% of another person's DNA or has the same parents. It has a legal meaning. So, if someone marries into a family or is adopted or by like legal contractual relationships, two people can be sisters without having biological genetics in common. There's also a cultural meaning. So uh in the kinship system that's common in like English in the US, sister is the term for a female relative of the same parents, and cousin would be the term if the parents were siblings. But there are other kinship systems in other languages where those two words would be the same word, and other kinship systems or languages where older and younger sister would have different words and not be the same exact concept. And also, of course, there's an emotional and interpersonal meaning. Somebody can call someone their sister because they have a close emotional family like bond, regardless of any of the above biological, legal, or cultural meanings. So, even though sister seems like a simple word on the surface, it's a social role. It means I, to this person, fit one or more of these meanings in a way that we have defined as this particular relationship dynamic. So, to get into the archetropy of it all, I like to compare it to my identity as a counselor and my identity as a paladin. Uh, Part of what contributed to me choosing the career that I did were innate traits, things in my personality, ways I thought about the world, being able to be analytical. It also partially was based on early experiences. I first got into psychology through like early science magazines about memory, and taking psychology courses in high school and college. In my state, there is a legal definition for what a particular kind of counselor is, and it means that I've received a particular degree, taken an exam, gotten a license and certification. There is an ethics code that I am expected to follow, so even though I meet the legal definition of counselor, I could not be acting as a counselor if I violate those ethics. When I was being educated in my graduate school education, our teachers often encourage us to start thinking of ourselves as counselors long before we took any exams or received any licenses or completed the required legal education, because they were sort of presenting the idea that being a counselor is a way of thinking or being that remains even outside of these technical, legal, or educational definitions. And it requires ongoing choices. I need to have continuing education to maintain my status as a counselor, and I could change my career at some point and then no longer be one. And I feel very similarly about my archetypal identity as a paladin. In some ways, some of the traits that make me feel like a paladin are innate. There are personality traits involved. I think my neurodivergence is a part of it, especially in terms of being someone who's quote unquote lawful good. Or, if we want to use pathological terms, rigid and rule following. My religious background is a large part of why I identify as a paladin and not other related terms like a knight. Some of it is voluntary. There's media and aesthetics that personally appeal to me and that I've deliberately sought out in order to cultivate this feeling, including myths of like King Arthur or stories with knights in them. There's overlap with other identities. I can't neatly distinguish what part of my loyalty as a paladin or a right-hand man is me separately versus my traits as a dog. And it overlaps with my career, which is often helping people. And there are a lot of deliberate decisions. I've written personal codes for my paladin identity. I've made deliberate decisions to engage in activism, such as receiving training to become a street medic, in order to be more paladin-like. And long before the term archetrope, well, not that long before the term archetrope was coined, I started identifying as a paladin in an archetypal way by deciding I'm going to be a paladin in real life. This is a concept that really appeals to me. It really fits my background, my history, and my personality, and I want to lean into it on purpose. I want to lead the kind of life so that other people observing me get paladin vibes. Um, and that was part of what motivated me to become involved in coining terms like archetrope. It felt And that's not to say that for other people it can't be more innate or less voluntary, but for me there was definitely an aspect of I am choosing to embody this. So is it voluntary or involuntary, intrinsic or extrinsic? As with kith, kin, link-like? Yes. All of the above. Yep. Even that one. Uh, it is personally in my own experience and in discussions with others around coining this term, it was hard to say that like, oh, this is exactly like a kintype or this is exactly voluntary because it was a mix of both and because it came from multiple roots coming together. So getting into additional terms and symbols. Paratypes was coined by Poppy / Ben / Aetherians in 2019. The current meaning is generally a character, animal, or mythical creature that is not a kin, therio, or fic type or heart type, but somehow feels important to your established identity, usually because they remind you of your kin type in some way or they're related to it. So, to give a more classical example, as a dog therian, I have paratypes in other dogs that are sort of similar, and also sheep because shepherd dog. Um, I've been using the terms paratrope for a similar or related trope or archetype. So for Paladin, I think magical girls hit a lot of the same buttons, and for Right Hand Man, I have a lot of strong feelings about Lancers, minions, and what TV Tropes calls the dragon. This is the one change from the other con panel. This is it. At the time, I was trying to use para-archetrope to mean a character that embodies or relates to an archetype, but I would be the first to admit that that was unwieldy as heck as a word, and I've taken to using exemplar as just a much neater, clearer word that already means that. Uh, so, for example, for my paladin identity, the Mouse Rapid Sheep from the Narnia books is a really good example of a paladin. Or Lucien from the Sandman comics is a right-hand man character, and that activates some of these archetypal kin-like feelings. So way back in 2021, I got so excited about coining the word archetrope and being in these discussions that I made this very janky looking symbol about it that other people then made better. um, so the reason I can get into some of the symbolism intended in this, so I deliberately wanted it to look both like a seed with roots and a campfire. So the root aspect is meant to symbolize how multiple myth stories and elements come together to make an archetype. An archetype is by definition a broad concept. One character does not make an archetype. You need multiple people sort of fitting into the same model. And also multiple aspects of life and experiences, both voluntary and involuntary, form an archetype. The droplet-looking shape is meant to evoke both a seed, the idea of like growing from roots, being primordial, and a fire, to evoke the idea of storytelling or passing on a torch across mediums or across time. And I wanted it to look sort of dual or doubled, to evoke that aspect of resonance or mirroring that I think is an important part of archetypes. The idea that an archetype is a mold that things are being cast from or fit into, the idea of like if we use the seed visualization, the idea of like opening, growth, and development, and also the idea of a shadow to get back at that idea of like storytelling and projection and these like big but flat versions of ideas. And also because I'm a psychology nerd and Jung talked a lot about archetypes and also had the idea of a person's shadow, so I wanted to sneak a little Jung in there. There was also a flag that was developed around that time, with the colors relating to media, so that like CMYK, like digital light projection, sign meaning tropes and archetypes, blue to relationship to other aspects of identity, magenta for depth and intensity, red as a distinct identity within alterhumanity, yellow for creativity and diversity, green for development and transformation over time, and black for shadow and imprint. And I've heard some folks that are like, oh, I think archetropy would fit my experiences, but I don't like the word, or I don't like the flag, or I don't like the symbol, or I think it's all kind of ugly and weird. That's fine. It's fine. Don't use the symbols if you don't like them. Don't use the terms if you don't like them. Make up your own. Try other things. I will not be personally offended. It doesn't matter. If you think about it, our modern alphabet, or at least the modern English alphabet, developed over thousands of years from pictographs. The archetypal community right now is in baby form. We are at the bull's head and stick figure era of having symbols and terms for this community. These words and symbols will change over time, regardless of whether I do or say anything about it or not. So by all means, please turn the stick figure into an E if you don't like the stick figure. Like, I absolutely expect these terms and symbols to develop or change or get thrown out or get replaced, but they can only do that if people actually use them or make up their own or get involved. Which brings me to my last conclusion and call to action. If this term fits you, please use it, or, like I said, make up a different one. Talk about it, write about it, question it, challenge it, explore it, engage in introspection with yourself and discussion with others. I want this to be a community. I think there's a lot of people who this would fit. I think there's a lot of people who would benefit from these discussions. And I think there's already a community here, but only if people actually talk to one another and make it a community. So please, in whatever way suits you, I am inviting you to jump in the pool uh, and really take off with this. And I will hold on these slides for a few seconds for the recording, so that people can check my references if they want. There are several of them. Okay, that is the end of the presentation, and I will jump into questions. Gosh, I'm gonna have to scroll through some chat to see questions. Wait. Yes, gender neutral man. Um, Hey, thanks for sharing. Uh, um, yes, magical girl mention. Um, hmm, okay, I will look in the questions chat for questions to collect them all in one place. Panel questions, here they are. Where can I learn more about this after the con? Um, so, my answer is going to be like, there's not much. I know there's an archetype tag on Tumblr that is 50% my essays. Please make it not 50% my essays. Please throw your own writings in there. Although, recently I know someone put together an archetype web ring that I hope somebody will put in the chat link if they are around. There is an archetype Discord that I don't know if I have the right to invite like 50 people into. But it's where we exist. uh, um, what kind of archetypes do you think people are most likely to resonate with? Do you think that's going to end up in those ones being more represented in the archetypal community as time goes on, or do you think it will be a little more even as people resonate with vastly different things? Part of me hopes that it'll even out a bit as people resonate with vastly different things. I'm sure, like, I've met a lot of paladins, myself being a paladin, but that might be because all of the paladins find to talk to one another. I believe personally that there's a lot of vastly different archetypes out there, And I hope partially one of my motivations for giving this panel is to sort of pull them out of the woodwork and encourage them to share their experiences. I want to hear from the dumb blondes and the jesters and the fools and the princes. Um, Although there might be a bit of a self-selection bias in that there might be people who identify strongly with archetypes whose way of expressing that doesn't visually show up a lot in online community discussions. Like, for example, one of my partners openly and comfortably identifies as an archetypal fool and bard, but just isn't really involved in, like, doesn't use alterhuman terms, isn't involved in the community, and has no interest in being so because they're not very label focused. Um, so I am hoping that there's a lot of variety, but there might be some amount of filtration that happens just based on what kinds of people are more likely to be focused on actually using terms and being online. Do you have anything about conceptkin versus archetypes? Honestly, I think there's a lot of overlap there. I think they sort of, I think archetypes are concepts. They're just, it's sort of like a bigger and smaller category. The way that all dogs are mammals, but not all mammals are dogs. So, right, like an archetype by definition is a concept, but there are also concepts such as like music and space, which aren't really archetypes. So, mm, um, depending on how you want to talk it, you could talk about it. You can use both words; they're not exclusive. Um, uh, what do you do when you lack the words and do not know what archetype is? Depending on what you mean, what an archetype is or what the archetype itself is. I am personally a fan of use whatever words you have until you have better ones. Right? So paladin fits for me, but I could have just as easily used other concepts of the idea of like, it's a magical warrior thing. I've seen people um who definitely have an archetypal identity, but because there's not one neat term for it, have to use phrases and sentences like it's a sort of star power superhero type. um, so I am all for people coining their own words, using language in whatever way they can, like get their point across. Um, I've seen an uptick in people using archetype to describe their own identities. Yay! Since you've given this panel before, have you noticed any major developments and ideas relating to this concept of archetypy since you've presented it? I've seen some more community development happen, like I said, sort of Discord's coming up, more people writing about it, flag and term coining posts, which I have mixed feelings about because I am all for people making flags and coining terms, as I explained in my symbolism rant. I just want those to be done by the people that have those identities and not just sort of churned out generically. But yeah, I'm hoping the development continues as I proselytize at more people about it. Any thoughts on overlap with deitykin in the sense that most polytheistic religions have some degree of spirits and deities that are personifications of concepts and archetypes? I think that is a very interesting concept. I don't have like a clear answer. I just think that is very cool. It makes sense to me that someone would be like, oh, I'm this deity, and this deity is an embodiment of this concept, so I'm also this concept. That makes a lot of sense. I don't see why somebody couldn't use both words if they thought they fit in terms of terminology. But I definitely can see the overlap there, and I think that is fascinating, and I would love to hear more about it if people have those experiences. Also, I know I'm technically the panelist, but I hope other people in the chat feel empowered to answer one another's questions because I have to emphasize I am not the president of Archetropes. I am not the only person with authority to answer questions. Please talk to one another. I swear. It's okay. Also, I see y'all in the chat making me president of paladins. I abdicate. Also, follow-up question. In that sense, if say a singular character embodies this idea or concept, or maybe a multitude of archetypes would using said character and calling them an archetype, okay? You're potentially misusing the term. Again, I am not president of Archetrop's disclaimer. You can use whatever language you want. um, my personal individual opinion as one person is that it's hard to call any one character an archetype. That being said, that can still definitely happen. Like, I think this discussion came up on Tumblr once where it was somebody talking about identifying as Mario as a concept, not any one specific Mario from any specific game, but like the broad concept of Mario across multiple games. And I think that's sort of in that gray area between like when does one character become a stock character? When does a stock character become a trope? There is definitely a gray area in between those things that I cannot police. Right. Batman is technically a single fictional character, but also Batman is definitely not one single fictional character. Somebody just said Clado Fictionkin in the chat, and I gotta say, I am loving it. Would Clado I mean, honestly, these are the kind of discussions I am glad to encourage. I don't know the answer to that. Let's figure it out. Like, let's all talk about it and see what makes sense. Right, I think I've surpassed my half hour, but I can stick around for questions if um, people have more. I know I don't think I'm bumping in against anyone.